Picture this. You wake up on a Tuesday morning and everything seems normal. Your phone buzzes with the usual news alerts. Coffee's brewing, life is predictable. Then, by Thursday evening, the entire global supply chain has been turned upside down. Prices are spiking, shelves are looking sparse, and economists are scrambling to explain what just happened. This isn't some hypothetical disaster scenario. This is the story of how modern export restrictions collided with an unexpected surge in deliveries, creating a perfect storm that caught nearly everyone off guard. And here's the thing that should concern all of us. It could happen again, possibly worse next time. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened during those critical 48 hours. We'll look at the warning signs that were ignored, the dominoes that fell one after another, and most importantly, what this means for your everyday life. Whether you're managing a household budget, planning for retirement, or simply trying to understand why prices keep climbing. By the end of this, you'll understand the mechanics of supply shocks in a way that makes sense. No economic jargon, no complicated charts. Just the real story of how our interconnected world can unravel faster than most people realize. If you want to stay ahead of stories like this before they hit the mainstream news, make sure you're following what happened after. We break down the events that shape our economy and our lives, giving you the context you need to make informed decisions. Let's start at the beginning. To understand how everything went sideways so quickly, you need to know what the landscape looked like before the crisis hit. For the past several years, countries around the world had been quietly implementing export restrictions. Not the kind that make front-page news. These were the subtle policy shifts that only trade specialists and supply chain managers paid attention to. One country would limit semiconductor exports. Another would restrict rare earth minerals. A third would put quotas on agricultural products or fertilizers. The reasoning always sounded reasonable enough. National security, domestic priorities, protecting local industries, supporting domestic jobs and manufacturing. Each restriction, taken individually, seemed like a minor adjustment, a small tweak to international trade policy. But here's what most people missed. These restrictions were stacking up like kindling, waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, shipping companies had been dealing with their own set of challenges. The pandemic had created massive backlogs at ports worldwide. Remember those images of dozens of cargo ships sitting idle off the coast of California? That was just the visible tip of a much larger problem. By late 2024 and early 2025, ports had finally started catching up. New automation systems were coming online. Labor disputes had been settled. Efficiency was improving. And there was this enormous backlog of goods that had been stuck in the pipeline for months, sometimes over a year. Think about that for a moment. You had massive quantities of products that had been manufactured, paid for, and shipped, but they'd been sitting in containers, on ships, or in warehouses waiting for their turn to move through the system. Medical supplies ordered in 2023. Electronic components manufactured months ago. Industrial equipment, consumer goods. All of it backed up like water behind a dam. Nobody connected these two trends. The export restrictions were one conversation, happening in government offices and trade negotiations. The delivery surge was another conversation, happening in corporate boardrooms and logistics centers. They were treated as separate issues. That was the first mistake. The catalyst came on a Monday morning in January 2025. A major exporting nation, one of the world's largest suppliers of industrial components, announced a comprehensive new export licensing system. The official statement made it sound routine. Enhanced oversight, better tracking, improved security measures. But the fine print told a different story. The new system would require detailed documentation for thousands of product categories. Processing times would increase from days to weeks. Certain strategic materials would face monthly export caps, and the regulations would take effect immediately, not in 6 months, not in 30 days, but within 72 hours. Supply chain managers across the globe felt their stomachs drop. 72 hours meant there was no time to adjust, no time to find alternative suppliers. no time to build up inventory. If you had a shipment scheduled to leave port on Thursday, you might not get approval until the following month. Within hours, companies started panic ordering. If you thought there was any chance you'd need components in the next 6 months, you tried to get them shipped out before the Wednesday midnight deadline. Manufacturers who had been carefully managing just-in-time inventory suddenly found themselves competing for the same limited export slots. The ports that had finally cleared their backlogs were suddenly overwhelmed again. But this time, it wasn't a slow buildup. It was a tsunami of urgent shipments all trying to leave at once. Here's where timing became critical. Remember those delayed deliveries I mentioned? The ones that had been stuck in the system for months? A huge wave of them were scheduled to arrive at ports worldwide during that same week. It was pure coincidence, the result of various logjams finally breaking free at roughly the same time. So you had this collision, massive incoming deliveries arriving at the exact moment that everyone was frantically trying to ship out as much as possible before the new restrictions took effect. The result was gridlock, complete, total gridlock. Let me take you hour by hour through what happened next, because the speed of this breakdown was remarkable. Hour 1 to 6, Monday evening. Word spreads through industry networks. Private messaging groups light up. Logistics coordinators start calling each other. The tone is still relatively calm, but there's underlying tension. People are trying to figure out workarounds. Hour 7 to 12, Monday night into Tuesday. Port operations go into overdrive. Facilities that normally run 2 shifts extend to 24-hour operations. Trucking companies are offering premium rates for immediate pickups. Warehouse space near major ports is suddenly worth its weight in gold. Smart operators are already seeing the opportunity and the problem. Hour 13 to 18, Tuesday morning. The backup becomes visible. Traffic at major ports increases by 40% overnight. Container yards are running out of space. Rail lines leading to ports are experiencing delays. And remember, this is on top of the surge of delayed deliveries that are simultaneously arriving. Here's what this looked like on the ground. A manufacturing plant in the Midwest was expecting critical components from overseas. These parts had been ordered 9 months earlier, but got stuck in the backlog. They were finally scheduled to arrive Tuesday. The plant manager had been checking tracking updates obsessively for weeks, watching the shipment make its way across the Pacific, then across the country. At the same time, that same plant was trying to ship out finished products to customers in Asia before the Wednesday deadline. They'd arranged for trucks, booked container space, coordinated with freight forwarders. Everything was supposed to happen smoothly. Instead, their incoming shipment got stuck in a traffic jam 20 miles from the port. The truck that was supposed to pick up their outgoing products couldn't even get into the container yard because it was full. And the export documentation they'd filed was suddenly in a queue behind thousands of other rushed applications. Multiply that scenario by thousands of companies, and you start to understand the chaos. Hour 19 to 24, Tuesday afternoon. Government officials start getting calls. Industry groups are demanding extensions. The original exporting country issues a statement saying the deadline is firm, no exceptions. Their reasoning, if we grant extensions, the whole point of the new system is undermined. Hour 25 to 36, Tuesday night into Wednesday. Prices start moving. Commodities markets react first, then futures contracts. Traders who understand supply chains realize what's coming. If this backlog doesn't clear, if these export restrictions stick, there's going to be a shortage of certain materials. And where there's shortage, there's profit for those positioned correctly. Hour 37 to 42, Wednesday morning. Major news outlets start covering the story, but most focus on the export restrictions themselves, not the collision with the delivery surge. Headlines talk about trade policy and international relations. Very few reporters understand the logistics nightmare unfolding at ports. Hour 43 to 48, Wednesday afternoon to midnight. The deadline hits. Thousands of shipments don't make it out in time. Others got through, but only because companies paid enormous premiums for expedited service. The ports are more congested than they've been in years. and now the real consequences start rippling outward. Here's what most people don't understand about supply shocks. They don't hit all at once like a tsunami. They spread through the economy like cracks in glass, each one creating new fractures that spread further. The immediate impact hit manufacturers first. Companies that depended on regular shipments of components suddenly found themselves with hard choices. Do you slow production? Do you find alternative suppliers at higher prices? Do you burn through your cash reserves to pay premium rates for expedited shipping? Many chose to keep operating normally, betting that the situation would resolve quickly. That turned out to be expensive optimism. Within a week, the shortage signals reached retailers. Products that relied on those industrial components started showing low stock warnings. Online listings showed longer shipping times. Store shelves in certain categories started looking sparse. For everyday consumers, the first sign was often subtle. That replacement part you needed for your appliance, suddenly it's back-ordered for 3 weeks. The electronics you were planning to buy, price went up 15%, and there's a note about limited availability due to supply constraints. But the real pain hit specific sectors harder than others. Medical equipment manufacturers faced genuine crises. Devices that required specific components couldn't be produced. Hospitals that had finally rebuilt their supply chains after pandemic disruptions found themselves rationing certain items again. This wasn't life-threatening for most facilities, but it was deeply frustrating for healthcare administrators who thought they'd finally achieved stability. The construction industry got hammered. Certain building materials, specialized tools, industrial equipment all became harder to source or more expensive. Projects that were scheduled to start in February or March got delayed. Contractors who'd given fixed-price bids suddenly found their profit margins evaporating or turning into losses. Small businesses suffered disproportionately. Large corporations could afford to pay premium shipping rates or had enough leverage with suppliers to jump the queue. A small manufacturer in Ohio or a boutique retailer in Florida, they didn't have those options. They got pushed to the back of the line and had to accept whatever terms they could get. And remember those delivery surges I mentioned? The goods that had finally broken free from the backlog? Many of them arrived at exactly the wrong time. Retailers who'd ordered inventory months ago during the shortage were now receiving massive shipments just as demand was softening or as the items were becoming less relevant. They'd paid premium prices based on old market conditions, and now they were stuck with excess inventory. This created a bizarre paradox: shortages and oversupply existing simultaneously in different parts of the supply chain. Let's talk about what this meant for the prices ordinary people pay, because this is where economic theory meets your grocery bill and your retirement savings. The immediate price spikes were concentrated in industrial and commercial sectors. Components that cost $10 before the crisis were suddenly $15 or $18. Shipping rates that had finally returned to normal after the pandemic shot back up. Companies that needed to move goods urgently were paying double or triple standard rates. Those increased costs don't stay isolated in the business-to-business world. They cascade down to consumers, but not all at once and not evenly. Some products absorb the increased costs without passing them to consumers. Businesses ate the higher expenses, hoping things would normalize before their next price adjustment cycle. Other industries immediately raised prices, particularly in sectors where they could blame supply chain issues without losing customers. For retirees and people on fixed incomes, this created a particularly difficult situation. Prescription medications that relied on specific imported components became harder to find or more expensive. Medical devices and health-related products saw price increases. Home repair and maintenance costs went up as contractors passed along their increased material expenses. The stock market reaction was mixed and complicated. Companies that had strong inventory positions or domestic supply chains saw their stock prices hold steady or even rise. Investors recognized they were better positioned than competitors. But companies heavily dependent on the affected export routes or materials got punished. Their stock prices dropped as analysts revised earnings estimates downward. For people managing retirement portfolios or investment accounts, this created anxiety and difficult decisions. Do you sell positions in affected companies? Do you hold steady and wait for recovery? Do you try to identify which companies might benefit from the disruption? The Federal Reserve and other central banks found themselves in an awkward position. Inflation had finally been coming down after years of effort. Interest rates had been carefully managed to bring prices under control without triggering a recession. Now here comes this new supply shock, threatening to push prices back up. But this wasn't demand-driven inflation that could be controlled by raising interest rates. This was a supply problem. Raising rates wouldn't create more shipping capacity or make export restrictions disappear. It would just make it harder for businesses to finance their operations during the crisis. Once the initial shockwave passed, governments and businesses started adapting. Not quickly, not smoothly, but gradually. The exporting country that triggered the crisis faced enormous pressure to modify the new regulations. Other nations threatened retaliatory measures. Industry groups lobbied intensively. International trade organizations got involved. After 3 weeks, they announced modifications. The licensing process would be streamlined. Processing times would be reduced. Some categories of goods would be exempted. It wasn't a complete reversal, but it took some pressure off the system. Meanwhile, ports implemented emergency measures to handle the congestion. Extended operating hours became the new normal. Automation projects that had been scheduled for gradual rollout got accelerated. Temporary storage facilities were erected to handle overflow. Companies learned hard lessons and started restructuring their supply chains. The just-in-time inventory model that had been gospel for decades suddenly looked riskier. Businesses started holding more buffer stock, even though it meant higher carrying costs. Diversifying suppliers became a priority, even if it meant paying a bit more for redundancy. Some industries made fundamental shifts. Electronics manufacturers started looking more seriously at domestic component production, despite the higher costs. Construction companies began carrying larger inventories of critical materials. Medical device makers lobbied for strategic stockpiles of essential components. These weren't overnight transformations, but the crisis had exposed vulnerabilities that couldn't be ignored anymore. The recovery wasn't linear. There were setbacks and secondary disruptions. Some companies that had been struggling before the crisis didn't survive. Others that had positioned themselves well emerged stronger. By late February and into March, conditions had improved but hadn't returned to normal. Prices remained elevated in many categories. Lead times were longer than before. The easy confidence that had characterized global supply chains in earlier years was gone, replaced by cautious contingency planning. So what should we take away from those chaotic 48 hours and their aftermath? First, understand that our modern economy is far more fragile than it appears. We've built incredibly efficient systems that work beautifully under normal conditions, but can break down rapidly when multiple stresses hit simultaneously. The export restrictions alone might have been manageable. The delivery surge alone would have been absorbable. The collision of both created something worse than the sum of its parts. Second, recognize that early warning signs often get ignored. People who work in logistics and supply chain management saw this coming. The signals were there. But those warnings didn't reach decision makers or the general public until it was too late to prepare. For individuals, particularly those managing household budgets or retirement savings, this points to some practical strategies. Maintain more financial buffer than you might think necessary. When supply shocks hit, prices can spike quickly in unexpected categories. Having extra savings provides flexibility to absorb those shocks without disrupting your standard of living or forcing you to sell investments at bad times. Pay attention to supply chain news, even when it seems arcane or technical. Those stories about port congestion or export restrictions or shipping costs, they're early indicators of price changes that will hit consumer goods months later. What happened after covers these developing stories before they become crises, giving you time to prepare and adjust. Diversify not just your investments, but your consumption patterns. If you rely heavily on products from a single source or region, you're vulnerable to supply disruptions. Building some redundancy into your life creates resilience. For the broader economy, the incident sparked important conversations about economic security and resilience. How much efficiency should we sacrifice for reliability? How dependent should we be on global supply chains versus domestic production? Where do we need strategic reserves or backup systems? These aren't easy questions, and they involve trade-offs. Domestic production costs more, but provides security. Just-in-time inventory saves money but creates vulnerability. Global supply chains offer efficiency but introduce geopolitical risk. The comfortable assumption that markets will always clear efficiently, that supply and demand will naturally find balance, got seriously challenged. Sometimes disruptions happen faster than markets can adjust. Sometimes the adjustment process itself creates secondary problems. The critical question isn't whether another supply shock will happen, it's when and how severe it will be. The structural conditions that created the 48-hour crisis haven't gone away. If anything, they've gotten more complex. More countries are implementing strategic export controls, viewing certain materials and technologies as matters of national security. Supply chains are being deliberately restructured along geopolitical lines, with countries prioritizing friendly nations over pure economic efficiency. At the same time, the logistics infrastructure is still adapting to post-pandemic realities. Labor shortages persist in key sectors. Automation is improving, but creating new dependencies on technology and energy. Climate change is introducing new disruptions, from extreme weather affecting shipping routes to droughts impacting agricultural exports. The next shock might look completely different. It might start with an energy crisis affecting transportation costs. It might come from water shortages affecting semiconductor manufacturing. It might emerge from political tensions disrupting established trade routes. What we can predict is that the systems are tightly coupled and operating near capacity. There isn't much slack in the system to absorb shocks. When something goes wrong, the effects propagate quickly. For people trying to navigate this uncertainty, knowledge is your best defense. Understanding how these systems work, where the vulnerabilities lie, and what early warning signs look like gives you a crucial advantage. You can't prevent supply shocks, but you can position yourself to weather them better than those caught completely off guard. This is exactly why staying informed through channels like What Happened After matters. We track these developing situations, connect the dots between seemingly unrelated events, and explain what they mean for your daily life in clear, practical terms. Hit that follow button so you don't miss the next story that could affect your finances, your household, or your future. Those 48 hours in January 2025 revealed something fundamental about our modern world. We've created systems of remarkable sophistication and efficiency, but we've also created new forms of fragility. The same globalization that brought us abundance and low prices also created long supply chains vulnerable to disruption. The same technology that enabled just-in-time inventory also eliminated the buffers that used to absorb shocks. The collision of export restrictions and delivery surges was, in many ways, predictable. Not the exact timing, not the specific details, but the general pattern. When you build complex systems that operate near their theoretical limits, you become vulnerable to cascading failures when multiple things go wrong simultaneously. For most people, the crisis manifested as moderately higher prices and occasional product shortages. Annoying, but not catastrophic. For some businesses and industries, it was genuinely damaging. For the economy as a whole, it was a warning shot, a reminder that the stability we take for granted rests on more precarious foundations than we'd like to believe. The good news is that systems adapt, businesses learned, governments adjusted policies, infrastructure improved. We're marginally more resilient now than we were before those 48 hours. The bad news is that we're also more complex, more interconnected, and facing more potential disruption points than ever before. The next crisis won't be identical to this one, but something will happen. It always does. Your best preparation is understanding, not panic, not hoarding, not radical lifestyle changes, Just clear-eyed awareness of how these systems work and what you can do to protect yourself and your family when they inevitably break down. That's what we're here for at What Happened After. We help you make sense of the events that shape our economic reality, before the mainstream news catches up and after the initial headlines fade. Make sure you're following so you're ready for whatever comes next. The question isn't whether there will be another 48 hours that changes everything. The question is whether you'll see it coming.